Welcome everyone to a fresh episode of Catchweight. I hope you're all well, but without further ado, we have to dive straight in because we have a lot to sink our teeth into this week. So on Saturday night we had 4 cards. We had the UFC card, we had Matchroom Boxing, the return of British boxing this year, 2 other cards overseas as well, and then on the Sunday night we had a NXT Takeover event. So we're going to wrap all this up, break it down, and look at what is next in the world of combat sports and beyond. This is episode 11 of Catchweight. So we're going to kick things off with the prevalent story of the weekend. That, of course, is UFC 258. Kamaru Usman breaks GSP's record for the longest welterweight win streak in the UFC by stopping Gilbert Burns in the 3rd round. He did have to overcome some adversity, though. He found himself knocked over on the canvas very early into the fight after Gilbert Burns made a great start. But Usman adapted well, got behind his jab, and used one of those jabs to actually drop Gilbert Burns, following up with some ground and pound to finally vanquish his former teammate. There was a good embrace at the end between both fighters as well. It was an intense pre-fight stare down as well. Usman deciding not to touch gloves. The intensity was there, everything was there. Gilbert Burns came out, great variety of strikes. He had the right hand over the top that dropped Usman temporarily. Usman was able to get up, and the moment of truth came for him when he caught a head kick and threw Burns down. Well, Burns kind of fell to the mat. That gave Usman quite a long time to recover and get his bearings back after Gilbert was trying to invite him onto the ground. Of course, Usman wanted no business. That was perhaps one of the biggest questions going into the fight. It was almost a pick your poison kind of scenario for the Nigerian Nightmare. Was it going to be him striking with Gilbert Burns, who probably had the speed and power advantage, although, of course, Usman did go on to stop him on the feet? Or would it be the jiu-jitsu that Usman would have to deal with? Of course, he does like to keep people down, but when you go into the guard of Burns, you may not come out with that UFC title, as could have been the case on Saturday night. There were a few shots from the top that Usman landed onto the body of Burns that kind of bothered Burns. I feel the power did take him a bit by surprise. Of course, when you get dropped by a jab after coming up from lightweight and fighting the welterweight champion, there is always going to be that power discrepancy and difference there, and it paid dividends towards the end of the fight. Usman got behind the jab again. He finished the 1st round strong. 2nd round adapted incredibly well. And then in the 3rd round, early in the 3rd round, he stumbled Burns with a jab. And that was all she wrote. Some more ground and pound. Herb Dean was oohing and ahhing about calling the fight off. And then he did. And that was that. A 13th straight win. Kamaru Usman with a perfect UFC record, 13-0. Of course, he breaks GSP's record for the longest welterweight win streak. That is a hallmark of perhaps the calibre and the stature of Kamaru Usman's career now. Like I said, unbeaten in the UFC. He has fought everyone there is to fight. Masvidal, Colby, Leon. He's already fought them before. He'd likely fight one of them again in the future. Could he even go on to break Anderson Silva's record at this point? Anderson Silva's win streak stands at 16. Just 4 wins away to break that for Usman. And the way he performed against Gilbert Burns, the way he adapted and was able to ride the storm against a very good challenger, someone, of course, who knows a lot about him, just says it all, really. Usman perhaps doesn't get the credit he deserves, and perhaps we're all guilty of that. GSP's shadow does always loom over the welterweight division when you consider how he left on top, how he does always stay in the realm of discussion, but has yet to come back, obviously, except for that fight against Bisping for the middleweight belt. But it's maybe time to really pile on the credit now for Usman. He does it all. The striking has improved under Trevor Whitman now. The jab was money, and it just continued to back up Burns and eventually dropped him. When you drop someone with a jab, of course you can strike. So it'll be interesting to see how he goes on moving forward now. Of course, he didn't win the most amount of fans at UFC 251. A lot of people thought his performance against Masvidal was, in layman's terms, boring. He did have reasons for that, perhaps now you could say, with the broken nose and the like. He'd love to fight Masvidal again. I don't know if that would be as big anymore, but I would back Usman probably again to do it because he is more well-rounded than Masvidal, and he will break him down eventually. When you have someone that has such a solid wrestling background and then their striking is just going on leaps and bounds, like his first knockdown to Gilbert Burns was a pull counter right hand. Burns came in with the jab. Usman pulled back and landed a right hand that just stumbled Burns, and that was the beginning of the end as Burns backed up against the fence and was subjected to an onslaught. Usman is continuing to get better and better. He is evolving, and it is a problem. He is a problem at welterweight. I think he can hold that belt for as long as he wants. Of course, there's going to be a stylistic matchup. We know all too well about this sport that it is very difficult, unless you're Khabib Nurmagomedov, who still isn't out of the woods just yet, because if he returns, he could even get knocked out. You don't know what can happen in the sport. You are as vulnerable as anyone on any given moment at any given time. That is just how the sport works, and if you're fighting the best, then there's always going to be a risk. But Usman right now is looking quite untouchable at 170 pounds. Moving camps to train with Trevor Whitman, also with Justin Gage as a training partner, has already paid dividends. And he's already added some good new tools to the game, a lot of stance switching. Of course, the final shot that dropped Burns was from southpaw, so he dropped him with the right hand. Before this fight, I said that Burns' cardio will be quite pivotal in how the fight goes. Burns looked sharp to start with, his output was great, but he just began to fade. I believe after that kick was caught and he spent some time on the ground, when Usman was able to recover, that was it now. Usman dictated the pace from there on. He did get caught a few more times after that, but he just began to pull ahead and Burns began to break down. Less and less time he spent on the front foot, and when Usman's walking you down and Usman's walking towards you, it must be terrifying seeing your gas tank go and know that this guy's just going to keep on going from strength to strength, which is why, personally, he did call out Masvidal, obviously, in the post-fight interview. The fight I would most likely be up for would be the Colby-Covington rematch, just when you consider that Colby is one of the guys that can really push the pace with Usman. The first fight was fantastic. Maybe Colby could say that it was stopped wrongfully. You could say it was a bit of an early stoppage when you consider how much time was left in the fight, not long left. And Colby probably would have lost the decision anyway, so it's not too much of a factor. But the bad blood is still there. Of course, a big win over Tyron Woodley, stopping him in the final round. You could also say Leon Edwards is up there. Maybe the UFC are going to actually go and make the Leon versus Colby fight. I wouldn't be surprised if we get the Masvidal rematch just for the business terms and the fact that Usman wants it. Maybe Leon versus Colby for the number one contender, and the welterweight division is nicely mapped out. Where does Burns go from here? He hasn't fought the triumvirate of Masvidal, Colby or Leon, and there's also a fun fight with Wonderboy to make there. Maybe Michael Chiesa, that'll be a fun fight. There's a lot to work with for Gilbert Burns. This wasn't his night, he was outmatched, but he did drop the champ, and that'll be some good currency going forward in matchmaking terms. So, by no means is it the end of the line for Gilbert Burns. He put in a good showing, and I think for both fighters, they've still got a lot of business to take care of in the welterweight division. Who knows if they might end up crossing paths once again down the line. Now, just to touch on the rest of the main card, with all due respect, it was quite a thin main card in comparison to other cards. When Dana White is trying to take down streamers and so on, you'd expect him to put up maybe something a bit stronger. You notice sometimes, this is part of the UFC's business model, of course, but some cards are loaded and then other cards are very thin. Like, for example, next month we've got 3 title fights on one card, 2 title fights on the next card, whereas in this case, obviously not a hit on the actual fighters themselves, but Alexa Grasso and Macy Barber isn't really the blockbuster co-main event, say, that a Hooker versus Chandler match is. But nonetheless, a good performance by Alexa Grasso. She's finally coming onto her own now. They've always been question marks about whether she could replicate the success she had at Invicta, and she did a great job at shutting down Macy Barber for the first 2 rounds. Macy Barber came on strong and tried to take the fight over in the third. At 22 years old, bright future ahead for the prospect, so another learning curve for her. She did try and take the fight from her, like I said, but Grasso was able to keep her at range from the first 2 rounds and build that lead, and it never really was threatened after that. Then we had Kelvin Gastelum. It must have been good for him. He snapped a 3-fight losing skid with a big win over Ian Heinisch, and it was a grapple-heavy approach as well. Despite being the smaller man, despite Heinisch having the physical advantages in the wrestling area, it was Gastelum who was getting the takedowns. He landed a few good left hands, but Heinisch never could really get going. I think this will be a big win for Gastelum going forward. Losing to Adesanya in that war, losing to Darren Till, and then getting submitted by Jack Hermansson would have been a big knock on his confidence. But he's back in the win column now. He's only 29. He's still got a lot to achieve, and maybe he could still get coveted gold. Look what the other Ultimate Fighter winner from around that time, or that era of the UFC is doing. He's headlined the event, and he's got the second longest win streak in the UFC. Obviously, that is Kamaru Usman. Ricky Simon's grappling is a problem for anyone at the moment. Brian Kelleher was cut open early in the round, and that would just end up being a one-sided grappling display. This fight was intended for the prelims, but due to a cancellation, it got bumped up. I don't think they made the most out of it, but it's a win for Simon, who's got 2 wins now in the space of a month, so you can't knock that. And we had quite a funny moment in the first fight in the main card as well. Julian Marquez gets his first win in a longer-awaited return to the octagon, and then afterwards he calls out Miley Cyrus for Valentine's, and they have a bit of an exchange on social media. So not bad if you get your first win after a long layoff to kick open the main card, and you get a response from one of the biggest artists in the world. A big rise to his stock. So UFC 258 main card, I think Usman probably did save it in terms of how it ended. If it was an Usman 5-round snooze fest like Fight Island, it may have got a lot more criticism, but the way Usman finished it, he deserves all the plaudits. And I'll admit I was critical of how he conducted himself in the 5-round fight against Jorge Masvidal on Fight Island. I feel he could have taken him out, or he could have at least done more damage to Masvidal. Yeah, there were the toe stomps. That was more of just a little snippet of the fight that was just carried forward as a knock on Usman. If it is true that he did have the broken nose for that fight, then my respect goes to him. But regardless, you cannot deny what he's achieved. And the way he has gone through and carved out everyone in front of him, he has fought a who's who of welterweights. And he deserves to be up there now with GSP. He's broken GSP's record in terms of a win streak. Still a little bit of a way to go to eclipse the title defences. But the way he has trucked away and worked his way up from being an Ultimate Fighter winner to welterweight champion and a pound for pound top 3, I would say. You can't deny him. Props to Kamaru Usman. Let's see how he continues to essentially clean out the division, or maybe re-clean it now. He's perhaps not cleaning out the division per se, more just going over it with a fine-tooth comb, making sure no stone is left unturned. That is a legacy I believe he will leave with the way he fights now and the way he went forward as a champion. Adapting, you hit the canvas, you get back up, and you break your opponent. That is how Usman works. That is how he will always work. And it will be exciting to see who's in there with him next, because I think he's going to be a heavy favourite. And I think this will be the turning point for him now. It was a big, high-stakes fight. He didn't really get it done against Masvidal in terms of getting that big finish. He got the big finish here. It was fun. It was exhilarating. And it was record-breaking. So Kamaru Usman reigns supreme at UFC 258. Now from the 8-sided cage to the squared circle. There was a lot of boxing on Saturday night. And perhaps the biggest story of them all, the return of British boxing, the first British boxing card of the year after the third national lockdown of the COVID pandemic put everything on hold. British Boxing Border Control ruled out any boxing events for January to prevent a strain on the emergency services. And here we were, Wembley Arena. Josh Warrington, who had been stripped of the IBF title, goes in there with a 22-year-old Mauricio Lara. It should be his triumphant return, his first fight back under Matchroom, and he gets stopped. He doesn't just get stopped, he gets hurt pretty badly, and it suffers his first professional defeat in the process. It was a truly disastrous night for British boxing and Josh Warrington. So the opening few seconds actually looked good for Josh Warrington. He looked like he was going to impose himself, and there was almost a novice feel to Lara. You would have thought that maybe this would end quickly the way the first bit of action went. But then when both began to exchange and trade leather, it became clear that Warrington maybe didn't have enough to back off Lara, and Lara would just keep coming forward. There was nothing to deter Lara, and that was up until the 4th round. After landing several left hooks, he lands one that really just rocks the world of Josh Warrington. He stumbles back, his legs are gone, he goes towards the ropes, he's on survival mode from this point, and then another left hook lands and he goes down. There's about half a minute left in that 4th round. They keep on going. Josh Warrington is out on his feet at this point. You'd think that maybe the corner would be close to stopping it, or the referee would. At one point, he is just literally, I think, one shot. If one shot landed clean, then Warrington would have been concussed. He goes back to his corner, stumbles back to his corner. For some reason, the referee is paying more attention to Mauricio Lara when you would have expected him to follow Josh Warrington to his corner, have a look, check that he's okay, check that he's fit to continue. The corner give him advice, and instantly he comes back out. Maybe the corner should have stopped it, but obviously that is not my place to say. I'm sure they have many conversations about this in the gym, talking about the fights, about what circumstances they want it stopped in, and so on. The corner shout to Josh, tell him to box with him this time, and within a few seconds he's already trading leather again, and he almost looks ready to go in the 5th round. Credit to Warrington, he does stable the ship for some time. Lara is patient. The patience of a saint at some points. The commentators were suggesting that maybe he'd lost the chance, but he certainly did not. He kept on landing that left hook, Round 9, another left hook lands, and Warrington is just eating them at this point, continuing to take him on the chin, and then he finally goes down, and that's it. The referee mercifully calls it off. Then a little scary moment as Warrington takes his time to get back up, and he requires oxygen. Lara, respectful in defeat, signalling the paramedics to quickly see to Warrington. But what a big win this is for Mauricio Lara. Very experienced for his age, but a resume nowhere near to Josh Warrington. Josh Warrington has fought so many top tier names in the featherweight division, and this is now a big blow to Warrington, considering he was talking about having all these super fights. You know, the IBF super featherweight title he had to vacate because they ordered the mandatory defence with Kid Galahad, and now here he is. He was on the cusp of having the big fights. Of course, COVID would have ruined that as well, considering the time off. But he's a guy who's always talked about taking the Leeds contingent over to Las Vegas. Now you wonder that night might not come. I think the fans, without the fans, probably would have affected him a lot. He is a guy, the Leeds warrior, he feeds off the fans. Without that, in an empty arena, when you're fighting someone you're supposed to beat, all of a sudden you're in a fight, it makes you wonder. And I'm sure Josh Warrington was probably having an internal battle inside his head about what was going on, because before the knockdown he was struggling as well. He was flat, struggling to get going. Even when he did land some shots, he would eat some, and he just didn't have enough power to take on Lara. Lara had more power, and he made that show. It was concerning to see Josh Warrington take as much damage as he did, though. The fourth round, I believe there were several opportunities from several different people to stop this fight. The first knockdown, he was able to get up, but he was out on his feet for the last 20 seconds. If maybe there was a bit longer in the end of that round, I think Lara would have been able to get him out of there at that point. He didn't. He goes back to his corner. He's stumbling. The referee doesn't even check on him, as I mentioned earlier. The corner don't even mention calling the fight, and they let him go back out. He looked almost drunk when he was walking back to the corner at the end of the fourth round. That is no way to continue, knowing that you're going to take more punishment to the brain. Again, he takes more damage in the fifth round. 6th, 7th, 8th, he does well to compose himself, but in the 9th it's all over. And I think those last few rounds were unnecessary damage to take for Josh Warrington. There was no way he would have been able to win that fight after the knockdown. He didn't have the power. He couldn't have the power to back up Lara. So I'm not sure what they were banking on by keeping him in that fight. It would have been a miraculous KO, one that would have defied all the odds, and one that was not, I believe, was not worth the risk of the damage to his brain that he took in the fight. I do wonder what they'll do with this scenario now. I wouldn't be surprised if they make Warrington Lara 2, maybe a year down the line, but they're going to have to give Warrington maybe a tune-up before that, because Lara is a destroyer, and he's only going to get better when you consider his age and factor in all of that. We may have a new name now. We were talking about Warrington going for those big fights, maybe a Gary Russell Jr. or the Kang Zhu, the Chinese WBA champion. But maybe Lara will be taking this spot now. So some very interesting times for the featherweight division. While they may have lost the start, I wouldn't say lost though, because I think Josh Warrington can come back and rally back now. You would hope that this doesn't have long-term implications on his career, but it possibly could be because of the inability and inaction to stop the fight. But this is a loss that will certainly sting for Josh Warrington. You take all that time off, this would have been the big fight to springboard his way into those bigger fights, and he suffers a career-shortening and possibly life-altering loss. So I wish all the best to Josh Warrington. I hope he can recover and maybe make a go of things again. And Mauricio Lara, exciting to see what he achieves now, a young Mexican prospect. Let's see if they can get behind him and push him correctly to maybe challenge for a world title in a couple of years' time. So he would have had a light heavyweight headliner for the top ranked card in California on the same night. But of course, you guessed it, COVID-19 ruined those plans as Vlasov was ruled out of his fight against Smith Jr. Therefore, former world champion Richard Commey made use of all the main event spotlight as he got rid of Jackson Marinas in 6 rounds with a blistering performance. He took the centre of the ring from the start, popping in with his jab. He landed a good left hand. Marinas did try and come back in the next few rounds, but in the 3rd round there was a big right hand that backed him up, and Commey was just walking forward and really just landing his shots. Marinas was eating them, moving well off the ropes, but Commey's confidence just continued to build. Also a nice little moment to see Teofimo Lopez, the former foe of Commey. Of course, Lopez knocked him out to set up the Lomachenko fight. He was actually giving Commey some pointers in the ESPN studio at that time. It would all come to an end in the 6th round. Marinas with some good character, working hard from the left hand especially, but Commey caught him with the right hand, swarmed him. Marinas tried to throw him back, but it wasn't enough to earn the respect of Komi and get him off him. I believe there may have been some sort of low blow or a body shot. Either one, anyway, hurt Marinas, and it backed him up towards the ropes. Komi swarmed him, down on Marinas. He was able to answer the count, but Komi comes again, lands a perfect 1-2. Marinas bounces off the ropes and straight onto the floor, and the referee says enough is enough. A big win for Komi, and he may add himself into the mix now. We always talk about the lightweight sweepstakes, so to speak. Lomachenko and, of course, the so-called Four Kings, Haney, Garcia, Lopez and Davis. Komi may be able to have a crack at them now. Of course, he has fought Lopez before. He may want to get that one back. But he has put in a good account for himself on this card with this exposure, considering it was all going to be about Smith and Vlasov. And instead he was bumped up to the main event and he got the job done in 6 rounds. Then we also had a card on the zone, which would have been for the IBF Super Featherweight title. But Jojo Diaz missed weight and was stripped of the belt, so it was only down to Rakimov to win it. He did a great job at trying to win it, but ultimately it ended in a majority draw, one judge scoring it in favour of Jojo Diaz, the other two resulting in a draw. Diaz looked sharp with some jabs to the body in the first 1 or 2 rounds, but Rakimov's aggression began to wear on him and he really did build a lead in the fight. I thought Diaz was not throwing enough, perhaps maybe picking his shots at times, and by the 3rd round he had a bloody nose. Rakimov was doing a great job at just tapping the shots and then trying to come around the guard. He was delivering the volume. He was landing a couple of times despite the corner of Diaz trying to say it was all landing on the arms. Yes, he did get a lot of glove, but he also did land on several times. It was a great account from Rakimov. I was watching it wondering when he was going to begin to tire. You maybe think that would be the case in round 5. He was slowing down. Diaz was beginning to try and find the counters. And to his credit, Diaz's left hand was just getting more and more educated as the fight came on. He was timing that 1-2, that straight left down the pipe, some good left hooks as well. He did need more activity though, and perhaps this is where the experience paid dividends because he was able to come forward and really take the fight in those final few rounds. He did get hurt by a right hook, but he came back with a 1-2. The action continued to pick up the 8th round. Diaz's timing was getting better, but he did get staggered when both landed a left hand. But then the final few rounds, Diaz stepped up, was going forward. Rakimov was trying to get shots off, but I think Diaz had kind of figured it out by then, and he was able to get enough rounds to perhaps salvage the fight. One judge, of course, scored it in his favour. The other two believed it was a draw. As of right now, then, I believe that means the IBF title remains vacant. It would have been Rakimov's to win if he did get the win, and he did well. He just couldn't keep the output up. He sustained it for longer than I thought he would. But when Diaz started countering, I think Rakimov kind of went back to his old ways, not the ways that Freddie Roach was trying to preach on him, and it just allowed Jojo to take the fight from him, or at least take the win from him, ending in a majority draw. Just around the cards there as well, I forgot to mention on the Matchroom card earlier, Zelfa Barrett, great fight against Kiko Martinez. Kiko Martinez showing he is still one of the toughest fighters out there. I suppose he was unlucky to not get the win, although Zelfa did get behind his jab and really do well to save the fight after struggling in the early rounds. Also a big KO win for Big Baby, not Joel Miller, the other one. But he's actually called Real Big Baby, probably to avoid the discrepancies. But he got a fantastic KO off Kingsley Ibe for his 8th professional win. He is building that momentum. I think they're going to take it slow with him, but again, another prospect to look out for. So that just about wraps up the boxing part of this. 3 great cards, like I said. Boxing had a slow January, almost paving the way for the NFL. They don't really want to compete with the playoffs and whatnot. But now their cards are coming. We've got cards from 3 different broadcasters. We've got some more coming this weekend. We've got Frampton versus Herring later this month. Canelo also back in action. So plenty to look forward to and plenty to feast on in the coming weeks. And finally, to close out the weekend, we had NXT Takeover Vengeance Day. It ended with quite a big twist, but before that, there were some cracking matches. I'll admit, I watched NXT when it first started. I've gone off it a bit now. I've gone off WWE a bit now, but obviously with WrestleMania season coming up, I'm trying to make that effort to consume all the content I can, so I'm as invested as possible, really, for the grandest stage of them all, as they say. So yeah, Vengeance Day, NXT. I'd be lying if I said I'd watched any NXT in the last year or so, barring Edge's appearance on the show where he talked to Pete Dunne and Finn Balor, a warning almost that he could be challenging them for the title at WrestleMania. It started with a great match with Dakota Kai and Gonzalez in the Dusty Rhodes Classic. We had another great tag team match later on in the show. Johnny Gargano then retained his North American title against Kushida. I'm a big fan of Kushida. Haven't seen much of him, but the bits I saw of him in the ring against Gargano was excellent. I mean, the attire is unique. It fits into an image that he has obviously produced here. And of course, it is the heel route of Johnny Gargano to maybe steal that match almost. Then in the co-main event, do they have co-main events in WWE? I suppose they do, because they build it as the second biggest match of the night. It's a triple threat for the NXT Women's Championship. Io Shirai topping Marines and Storm. Another great match that was. Io Shirai is going to be a problem on the main roster. I'm just wondering when they're going to call her up. It's probably only a matter of time now, because she is a huge talent. I know they say main roster is now NXT included, but in terms of Raw and SmackDown, the big TV, so to speak, because NXT, it may be a third brand, but it still is a subsidiary to those two premier shows, and it'll be good to see her on Raw or SmackDown whenever that does happen. And then came the twist in a thrilling main event, a unique match. Pete Dunne with all the holds and finger snapping and whatnot. Him and Finn Balor just tore the house down for, I think it was about 30 minutes. One of the best matches I've watched in WWE in a long time. And the ending, it was quite a significant ending if you are an NXT fan. It appears the Undisputed Era are now no longer a thing. Possibly one of the most successful franchises, not only in NXT history, but in the whole history of the company. Adam Cole stunning fans as he lands super kicks on Finn Balor and Kyle O'Reilly, leaving everything in limbo. It'll be interesting to see how they move on from this now, because I think NXT will have a big storyline, a big blockbuster storyline going into WrestleMania. And props to Pete Dunne, 27 years old, really putting the UK on his back in terms of the WWE scene. Fantastic performance, and again, I'm excited to see what comes from him now. But yeah, they're just my little, somewhat generic thoughts and recap of NXT TakeOver. Like I said, I wasn't really too into the whole show or the storylines at the time, but I'm definitely going to be invested going forward now after, especially the last two matches. They were brilliant, and of course that ending, we don't know what's going to happen with the Undisputed Era. So that brings the end to this week's show. Almost rambling for about half an hour, I'm afraid, but it is what it is. Kamaru Usman is, of course, the man of the hour, the man of the moment. A sensational performance, a sensational way to remind fans of just how good he is, aligning himself with greatness now, defeating a game challenger. And Gilbert Burns was no pushover. He dropped Usman, but Usman was able to get up and use that mental and intestinal fortitude that he has become known for now. That is one of his greatest elements. That paid dividends, and he comes forward and stops Burns, in the third round. Josh Warrington, his career is now at a crossroads. A stunning upset. I do believe they will give him the rematch, but I do hope they give him some time and the British Board of Boxing Control and all the corners and referees involved have a good look in the mirror about what could have happened, because it could have had a disastrous circumstance on the night. His brain scans that he did have after the fight were returned all clear, but with brain injuries and things like this, they could have a very late onset of symptoms and it could be a delayed effect. So I wish Josh Warrington the best of health. I do hope he can get himself back in there. And finally, just a quick hat tip to the rest of the winners of the weekend. Another great weekend of combat sports, including WWE. And it's been another memorable one, and it's just going to pick up now. The schedule is going from strength to strength. We've got more big fights this weekend, and they're going to keep on coming. So stay tuned to Catchweight. We'll be on top of it all with previews, breakdowns, and everything else in between.